Hello and welcome to Gatekeeper. This episode will be in English since my very special guest is the famous and in some circles the infamous Professor Gad Saad. Hello, Gad.
How are you?
Nice to meet you. I've been following your stuff for ages because you are one of the few people who brought the anti-woke movement some humor. Most people on our side are very grave and very worried about the end of civilization. Your book is now in English too. The original, in Hebrew too, the original English title was The Parasitic Mind. It's called Parasitim in Hebrew, and you can now get it at Sela Meir. I'll post a link under this video with access to this book in a sale by Sela Meir. And Gad, this is the first time I've read a biographical sketch of yours in Lebanon in the 70s, in the midst of a civil war as a Jewish family. And I want to take you back first to something that I found very striking, because I was thinking it's not as grave. I was thinking of Jewish students in American campuses now being kept out of libraries by pro-Hamas idiots chanting from the river to the sea without knowing which river and which sea. And your impression begins here when you were 6 years old, I believe, and Nasser died. Can you say a word about that?
So that was I was not quite 6. I think I was just before turning 6. So it was in 1970. Gamal Abdel Nasser, the Egyptian pan-Arabist, the Egyptian president, had just died. The reason why I'm mentioning that he was a pan-Arabist is because he was very much loved and revered as a popular figure, because he's trying to unite all the Arabs under sort of one platform. And when he passed away in 1970, as often happens in the Middle East, people take to the streets with fervor. By the way, for your viewers who don't know this, Hamas means fervor, zeal, right? So if you go on the street with Hamas, that means you're doing it. That doesn't necessarily refer to the terrorist group. It means with zeal, with fervor. And so people were proceeding down our street. We lived on a street called Shari' al-Jaysh, which means the street of the army, actually, if you translate it into English. And there, the usual kind of lamentations and incantations and so on. And amongst them is death to Jews, death to Jews. And so I'm sitting there as a little boy looking over the balcony, hearing death to Jews. And I turn to my mother and I say, well, why are they chanting death to Jews? And, she's like, shut up, put your head down, don't look out too much. And so that was at least the first clear memory I had of what it was to experience Jew hatred in the Middle East. But then in the book, I talk about several other incidents.
It struck a chord with me. I remember when I was about the same age, we had cartoons on the afternoon on the single Israeli channel, and it only broadcasted until 5:30, I believe it was. And then we got Jordanian TV, and I remember the Arab announcers and my parents explaining to me that they want to kill us, and wondering why is that? Why would they want to kill us? It seems like a common Jewish experience, and I think Jews in Europe are currently experiencing the same thing, but now it's under the influence of this pathogen, the mind virus, which has welcomed anti-Semites. So you refer to this as a kind of illness in your book. How is it similar to a parasite?
Right. So let me step back to explain how I came up with this parasitic framework. So as an evolutionist, I often will look to other animal behavior to make an evolutionary argument, right? So if you're trying to make an argument that toy preferences are sex specific. Little boys prefer certain toys and little girls prefer other toys. And there is an evolutionary and biological reason for that. You might then study other animals to see if they exhibit the same patterns. And it turns out that rhesus monkeys, vervet monkeys, chimpanzees have the exact same sex specific preferences when it comes to toy preferences. So the idea of looking at other animals to make us to understand something about human phenomena is an inherent feature of what an evolutionary scientist would do. And so as I was trying to come up with a framework of what could explain such departures from reason, from common sense, from reality, I started reading the literature on parasitology. Now, parasitology is the study in the animal kingdom between hosts and parasites, the dynamics between them, the co-evolutionary arms race. But many parasites don't go to the brain. So, for example, a tapeworm tries to parasitize your intestinal tract. But a neuroparasite is a particular type of parasite that needs to end up in the host's brain, altering its neuronal circuitry and subsequently its behavior to suit its reproductive interests. So, for example, a wood cricket, when it is parasitized by a hairworm, the wood cricket detests water. It wants nothing to do with water. But when it is parasitized by this hairworm, because the hairworm needs for the wood cricket to jump into water in order for it to complete its reproductive cycle, the wood cricket, once it is parasitized, jumps merrily into the water, commits suicide because it is completely
and dies and drowns.
And it drowns. Okay. So then I had my epiphany. I said, aha, I'm going to now use the neuroparasitological framework to argue that human beings could not only be parasitized by actual physical brainworms, but they could be parasitized by a second class of brainworms. And I call these parasitic ideas or idea pathogens. And so in that sense, I'm drawing an analogy between physical brainworms and ideological brainworms.
So it's like a gene and a meme.
Exactly right. Exactly right. So Richard Dawkins, in his 1976 book, The Selfish Gene, argued that, yes, genes propagate, but human beings are both a biological and cultural animal. Therefore, we also have mimetic propagation. Hence, he came up with the concept of a meme. Now, the difference between, and of course, I cite Richard's work in The Parasitic Mind, the difference between a meme and a parasite, at least an ideological parasite, the way I'm speaking, a meme doesn't have an inherent valence to it. It could be positive, it could be neutral, it could be negative, right? If you start humming a song and I overhear it and later I walk and I'm humming it, you have mimetically transferred what you are singing to me. That has no parasitic quality to it. I'm not jumping into the water to commit suicide, right?
Well, Gadi, depends what song.
Depends what song. I agree. If it is the Beatles, then it is parasitic. We have to agree on that. But anyway, so that's why I did not use the mimetic framework. I needed something more punchy, more zombified, and hence I went the neuroparasitic route.
And I think the metaphor appeared earliest, and it's striking because computers were very rare and very clumsy back then. But I think it was Clifford Geertz in the interpretation of cultures who said that human beings are like computers in the sense that they have hardware, but the hardware cannot work without software, and the software is culture. And so if you think of it in this term, when the software goes wrong, when the software is infected, things seriously go wrong. And we saw them, we saw, I think, a culture derailed, because if I hope I'm not carrying the metaphor too far, but if the goal is reproduction, what happened to Western culture with the parasitic minds is that it's sort of lost its ability to preserve itself, hasn't it?
I mean, by the way, this might be the first time that I've been interviewed where someone makes a reference to Geertz. So chapeau to you, as we say. Well done. Clearly, you are an academic. I mean, that is literally true what you said, in that some of the parasitic ideas, never mind that they they drive you off the abyss of infinite lunacy in a metaphorical sense, but they literally shut off your actual reproduction. So, for example, in my next book, where I'm talking about suicidal empathy, so the birther movement, right? I am so empathetic, I am so kind, I am so compassionate that I'm unwilling to rape Mother Earth by doing the unthinkable, which is to reproduce and have my own children. Because of my infinitely suicidal empathy, I will shut off the most fundamental impulse that I have in my life. The game of life is made up of two steps: survive and reproduce, right? Because if I survive all you want, but I never reproduce, the genes end with me. And so you are exactly right that many of these parasitic ideas are a true Darwinian dead end.
And they seem to erode the very idea of culture, not just a specific culture. I'm thinking here, I'm free associating to our Prime Minister's speech at the joint session of the two houses of Congress, where he said, what is happening in Israel now with Hamas is not a clash between civilizations, it's a clash between civilization and barbarism. And it seems that the woke virus, like an autoimmune disease, is basically letting in barbarism into our own home, as if by some death instinct or an impulse of self-hate. Where does this, before we try to analyze the virus, where does the motivation come from in Europe? When has the West lost its will to reproduce itself, not just its people?
Fantastic question. So what I do in the Parasitic Mind is I discuss each of the parasitic ideas, and just for context for your viewers and listeners, postmodernism would be the granddaddy of all parasitic ideas, because it purports that there are no objective truths, other than the one objective truth that there are no objective truth, right? So that framework then allows me to argue that up is down, left is right, women can have penises, men can menstruate, right? So that gives me the, quote, epistemological degrees of freedom to then say anything I want. Now, but that's not the only parasitic idea. Cultural relativism. Who are you to judge the beliefs and actions of other cultures? Don't be a cultural imperialist. Social constructivism. Everything is a social construction. Biology doesn't apply for human phenomena. So each of these parasitic ideas were spawned on university campuses. As I always like to remind people, it uniquely takes professors to come up with some of the dumbest ideas, right? And so therefore, so to answer your question, depending on which parasitic idea we're talking about, we can give it a different timestamp. Some of the idea pathogens started about 100 years ago. So for example, earlier you mentioned an anthropologist, a cultural anthropologist, Franz Boas, a Jewish cultural anthropologist, is the sort of the genesis of cultural relativism. And then he trained many of his students to argue that there's no such thing as a human universal. There is no such thing as a shared biological heritage and so on. So that particular idea pathogen is almost 100 years old. Postmodernism is really 45, 50, 60 years ago with all of the French postmodernist bullshitters, if you don't mind me saying that. So Jacques Lacan, Jacques Derrida, Michel Foucault, and all of
Michel Foucault, the father of them all, and the most challenging. Yeah,
exactly. And so it depends on which idea pathogen we're talking about, but we could certainly say that the festering that we now saw sort of explode has its roots about 50 to 100 years ago. It took now. One more point, and I'll cede back the floor to you. When I first started standing on top of the mountain and screaming, hey, we have a problem here, many people would respond to me, yeah, you're right that these are silly ideas, but they are reserved to some esoteric department in the humanities. And then I would literally use the metaphor of an actual pathogen, and I say, but the virus eventually breaks out of the lab. This is way before COVID. So
you are Wuhan. You American departments of literature. You are Wuhan.
So they didn't have the capacity to, play the slippery slope argument, right? To forecast, to extrapolate from where we are to where we would end up being. I said to them, look, all of those people who are now being parasitized by this nonsense are going to become our leaders. And it's called Justin Trudeau.
Yeah. Let me insert a historical angle, because Winston Churchill said that perhaps in two world war, Europe has spent its soul. Does that apply? Does that connect? Does that lead in some way to the 60s? Because when I went to do my PhD, but the original plan, which, as you know, when you do a PhD, you have a grand plan and then you sink into one little segment of it. But my idea was to show that the rebellious youth of the 60s are the origin of all our troubles. And that started when I was very young, because in my youth, I was in love with this girl for too many years. And then came the ideas of the 60s and free love. And I thought, I'm not going to share her with anyone. Not that she ever noticed me or anything, but already I didn't want to share her. And so I guess that the grudge started there. But then you look at the 60s and it all looks so inspiring, and Woodstock and Give Peace a Chance and all that. But you look, these students felt deep disappointment with the West. They adopted a French theory, which they did not completely understand, in order to express their disappointment with their own culture, and they became the teacher. So is the context here a historical crisis that did not originate with academics, that originated with the general experience of people after two world wars?
I mean, no, in the sense that some of these parasitic ideas precede, or at least the earliest ones are around the First World War. So I wouldn't say it's an either or argument. There might be some validity to what you're saying. But by the way, as you were saying what you were saying, you said, I didn't want to share her with anybody else. That reflex speaks to a fundamental insight from evolutionary theory, right? I mean, the reason why men have evolved sexual territoriality is because men are very vested fathers within all of the animal kingdom, right? We are actually truly super dads compared to all other mammalian species. While we don't invest as much as women in the human context, we do invest heavily. We do much more than just have sex and reproduce. Therefore, it makes perfect evolutionary sense that if you're going to be a heavily invested father, that you make sure that it's not the sexy Greek gardener who fathers your kids, and then you spend the next 18 years raising someone else's genes, right? So therefore, the cognitive system, the emotional system, the behavioral system that causes us to feel sexual territoriality is perfectly easily explainable from an evolutionary perspective. So I'm here to tell you that it was perfectly natural for you.
Let me tell our viewers that this argument is made in detail in the book. And you also explain the difference between the kind of things that make females of the human species jealous, and the kind of things that make males jealous. So you obviously, if you read between the lines of the question already, you went head on with the postmodern gender feminism. First of all, let me commend you for the courage, because that is dangerous, is it not, in academia in Canada?
Oh my goodness. I mean, on any given day, there is a very long list of people coming after me. But, people have asked me, well, what is the unique set of skills that you had that, it had to be you? Well, of course, there are many elements in answering that question. One of which is, for better or worse, I'm genuinely a honey badger. In other words, I feel personally offended by bullshit, right? Like, I can't walk away from seeing someone espouse some lunatic thing on, say, social media, and I just say, forget it. Because if I do that, and maybe it's not good for my blood pressure, but I would then feel at the end of the night, when I put my head on the pillow to sleep, I would feel that I was fraudulent, because I knew that there was an attack and a murder on truth that happened. And I looked away and I pretended that I didn't hear the screams of truth when it was asking me to come and protect it. So I think one of the reasons why I literally go like this and I don't care about anybody coming after me is because I am my worst enemy, meaning that I've got to live up to my own standards, and I'd rather make sure to sleep well at night I don't care about the feminists coming after me. They can
Is it
all come
sometimes
after-
fun, though, to get into these skirmishes of ideas?
Incredibly so. But you remember earlier you said, you bring levity and humor into it. Now I do this for it's a natural reflex for me. It's not a strategic thing, but I do it really. It comes from two places. One, humor serves as a pressure relief for me, right? Because otherwise I would explode, right? If I don't make fun of some of this stupidity, then I would not be able to go on another day. But secondly, and here's a bit more of the pragmatic element, dictators, as you know, as a historian, they are not afraid of the guys with the big muscles, because those we can get rid of them very quickly. They're afraid of the guys with the sharp tongues, because they are the ones who can really attack my standing. Right, the pen is mightier than the sword is exactly referring to that. So we need to get rid of the humorists, the satirists, because they're the ones who will cause the most havoc to us. And so I use satire, sarcasm, for many reasons, one of which is that it's the perfect, as I explained in the Parasitic Mind, it's like the surgeon's scalpel cutting through layers of warm butter bullshit, right? Because, and by the way, that's why I don't also get canceled, because when I take one of my satirical positions, you don't know. I mean, yes, the people who know me know that I am being satirical, but you can't cancel me because I will literally say, I genuinely meant that. I really do believe that men can menstruate because I studied that at Oberlin College. So I'm untouchable. I found the singularity point, Gadi.
That's wonderful. Also, it's not just that the tongue is dangerous. Humor is dangerous. As Hannah Arendt observed, that laughter undermines authority like nothing else, and they're so pompous. There's the Israeli feminists have a very large group on Facebook, which I guess I'm not allowed on, but I can peek at, and which is called "I Too Am a Feminist and I Don't Have a Sense of Humor." They are proud of it, and one wonders what kind of creed makes people proud of not having a sense of humor. So, God, what has gone wrong with modern, postmodern feminism?
Well, so equity feminism is a great idea. It says, hey, there should be no institutional mechanisms by which men and women are not treated equally under the law, equally for hiring and so on, for promotion. And by that definition of feminism, then probably you and I would put up our hands and say, hey, we're equity feminists, sign us up. The problem then comes with radical feminists who then argue, in the service of pursuing that laudable goal, let us now promulgate the idea that there are no innate differences between men and women. It's all due to social construction, because then that makes the ultimate goal of eradicating toxic masculinity and the patriarchy more palpable. If we promulgate that argument, then it becomes easier for us to fight the patriarchy. There are no biological differences. And so that's why in the book, in the Parasitic Mind, I argue that each of these parasitic ideas begins from a noble place. It starts off with a noble reflex to solve some valuable objective, but in the service of that objective, if I have to murder and rape truth, so be it. Whereas I argue, no, I can walk and chew gum at the same time. I could pursue noble goals without ever ceding a millimeter of the truth in that service.
But they end up, it was most striking to a lot of Israeli feminists who I think had a rude awakening in the aftermath of October 7, when feminists sided with Hamas rapists against the Israeli raped women. And suddenly, I believe you turned into, wait, we need more evidence because being a Palestinian trumps being a woman.
Yeah, well, exactly. Well, that's why all of those feminists, they're the wood cricket that jumps into the water, right? That's like that. It can't be a more apt metaphor. I'm going to use an example from Israel to exactly demonstrate this point. And once I say the name of the person, you might even shake your head. And do you know where I'm going with the story, Gadi, or no?
No, I'm waiting.
Tal Nitzan. Do you know who that is?
I think I do.
Tal Nitzan
I'm not sure.
Is a Jewish woman. Probably she's part of the Facebook feminist group that you are not allowed to go into. I'm sure she is. She was pursuing some doctoral work. I think she was at Hebrew University, if I'm not mistaken. You can check the reference in the Parasitic Mind. And she wanted to do some research. Are you looking up Tal Nitzan? Is that what you?
I am. Yes, I am. You caught me. I
Okay,
found her. Yeah, go on.
Yeah. So Tal Nitzan, who's a lot more progressive and enlightened than degenerates like me. So she wanted to demonstrate that the IDF engages in massive, rampant rape of Palestinian women, right? Because she's progressive, because she knows how to engage in self-loathing, because the only road to repentance is to suicidally hate yourself as much as possible. Okay, great. So then she goes out and she conducts the research, and she can't identify a single instance of documented rape by the IDF soldiers on Palestinian women. Now, you have a PhD, I have a PhD. We are taught that you go where the evidence leads you. If your hypothesis is falsified, well, then so be it. But in the world of the parasitized monsters, your ideology could never be falsified, right? It doesn't adhere to Popper's falsification principle. So when we found out that the IDF didn't rape anyone, did she alter her position that they are monsters? No, she just pivoted a bit.
Yeah.
They are so horrifying in their othering of Palestinian women that the Palestinian women are no longer valid women that are worthy of being raped. So they are so evil, the IDF, that they wouldn't rape the women. So if she had uncovered rape, it would prove that the IDF is disastrous. And if she uncovers no rapes, it in no way affects the fact that the IDF are terrible monsters. This is not a feminist at Oberlin College who learned that Hamas is freedom fighter. This is Tal Nitzan, Jewish Tal Nitzan at Hebrew University. So the parasites know no bounds.
Yes, but a professor or a PhD candidate at Hebrew University needs recommendation from Oberlin College or for somewhere else in America. So they write to produce. When I was a young professor and I was very passionate about my anti-postmodernism, and I came to an older professor and I said, "This is horrible. Whole departments here are infested with this, and they're all so ideological." He said, "They're not ideological at all. They just have to publish, and they know that this is the mood. We are completely slavishly, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, subservient to the American Academy. So that even if you are a professor of Hebrew literature, believe it or not, you need to publish in English in America in order to be promoted." And what happened in America is unbelievable. I was there at I think the very last moment where you could still speak some of the truth. I had to leave class and take independent studies because professors were. One professor walked out in the middle of I was saying something, and he just walked out of the room in the middle of my speaking.
Do you remember what you were saying?
Yeah. It was. I'll say for my department at Rutgers University, the history department, that he got reprimanded because I'm a teacher. You're a teacher. You don't label a student as a persona non grata. You just don't. Even if something that's said is outrageous, you do not just turn your back and go. I was stunned, and it's a foreign country, but I learned my lesson, and then I did independent studies, and that went very well. But I experienced the same thing as you, because when I started doing with it, they thought this is the margin of some godforsaken departments of literature and Israeli history, and it became so incredibly influential. So now I want to get to something I've argued with you many times in my head, Gad. So now I'm going to let you enter into my internal dialogue with you and see if you know your lines. So sit tight. It's not just you, because my argument, I guess, with the critics of wokeness in their many generations, they label this as cultural Marxism, and the logic is obvious, because Marxism taught you that there's there are oppressors and the oppressed, and the terms were economic, and this was then shifted to identity, and now the same model applies to women, to blacks, to invented categories from the American census, such as Hispanic Americans and others. And what I think is missing in all this is that the American left has also radical individualistic roots. And because I studied classic American ideas in my PhD, I then read Judith Butler. Read is not a good word. I then struggle through the ointment of Judith Butler's horrible, arrogant prose, because she says simple things. It's just, if you blow them up behind this impenetrable jargon, then you seem very deep. It's not deep, but it's also not really Marxist. This is, you read this and you say, I've seen this in a John Wayne movie. That's the self-made man is now the self-made transgendered individual. And the whole logic is only I will decide who I am. And then if you are trained in American thought, then you read Emerson and you say, Emerson said that the self is always a work in progress. This is what these people are repeating. And then you say, wait a minute, and you go back to France, and Foucault is also not a Marxist. Foucault is a Nietzschean. And what Foucault is striving for is not class solidarity in any form. And when you take this back to identity politics, is, one of the first brilliant insights, her, Christina Hoff Sommers. She's absolutely brilliant. In her book, Who Stole Feminism? That was the 90s. And she said, when I came to a conference of the National Association of Gender Studies Professors. In the 80s, we had an agenda. We were supporting the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment, and other things. When I came back in the 90s, the groups kept fragmenting. And then I'm improvising, but it's very close to what she said. The group of overweight Jewish women whose sexual identity was in transit split into the allergic and the non-allergic. And the allergic demanded that no one come to the conference with dry cleaning clothes because it makes them sneeze. So
you're saying it's a misnomer to use the term cultural Marxist, which is a collectivist term, on these fragmentations into unitary identities. Did I summarize this properly?
Close. I'm less belligerent, and I would say that cultural Marxism is half the story. The other story is when it meets American individualism, because why are these groups fragmenting? They are fragmenting because no one will define me from the outside. This is why the melting pot is wrong. This is why feminism is white and we now need black feminism. This is why black feminism is going to split into straight and gay. So the floor is yours.
Yeah, that very nice lead-in. By the way, just to set the record straight, I don't use the term. I would challenge you to find a writing where I use the term cultural Marxism. I don't use it. So in a sense, I'm supporting your position. Okay. Although I do believe that Marxism is a parasitic idea, right? So I'm not saying that wokeism is just a manifestation of cultural Marxism. So in that sense, I agree with you. But it is certainly the case that Marxism is completely parasitic. As a matter of fact, in my forthcoming book, in Suicidal Empathy, I have a chapter. I mean, it's still in flux, so it might change the organization. But I have a whole chapter on parasitic taxation, which comes with the social welfare state, but it really is rooted in empathy, right? I mean, because we are so empathetic, us, the benevolent, magnanimous government, it only makes sense that we take from the super productive and rich and redistribute that, because we should all be equal. So there is a parasitic, I mean, literally a parasitic element, because I am sucking off all of your labor and talent to redistribute it as I see fit. And by the way, remember earlier I was saying that your reflex about feeling sexually territorial was perfectly evolutionary. I want to link what we said earlier to the socio-political economic system and human nature. E.O. Wilson, are you familiar with E.O. Wilson?
No.
E.O. Wilson he just recently passed away, and I so regret that we never got a chance to know each other. He was, arguably one of the most famous evolutionary scientists in the 20th century. by training, he's an entomologist, an insect scientist, specifically specializing in social ants. And he wrote a very influential book that was kind of a precursor to evolutionary psychology called sociobiology, where you apply biology to study social behavior across animals, including humans. And he was part of the early culture wars because his colleagues at Harvard, who were themselves completely evolutionists, did not accept the fact that you could apply evolutionary theory to explain human behavior because that would be contrary to their Marxist philosophy, right? So they were already parasitized. But the reason why I'm saying this whole long-winded story is because when E.O. Wilson was asked, Professor Wilson, I mean, I'm paraphrasing the exchange. Professor Wilson, what are your views on socialism/communism? He paused and said, "Great idea, wrong species," which is one of the most beautiful quotes I've ever heard with very, very few words, because social ants are communistic. There is a reproductive queen, there is a class of warrior ants and a class of worker ants that are completely and utterly indistinguishable from each other. They're just one small cog of the bigger wheel. So some species have a phylogenetic history whereby they genuinely have evolved communism as the optimal pathway. Humans are not communistic. Some of us are taller, shorter, smarter, harder working, more ambitious, less ambitious, better looking, less better looking. So to impose a socio-political economic model that is perfectly incongruent with human nature, it doesn't take fancy Professor Gad Saad to tell you that it will always fail, as history has shown repeatedly in every culture where it's been tried.
How does nationalism fit in that discussion? Because there is a communal social side to human beings, which I think radical individualism fails to be able to explain. So if you follow the path of, I don't know, Hobbes and Freud, you cannot explain why people would sacrifice their lives for something larger than themselves. Why do they? Ants do.
Right. Yes, great question. So two ways to answer that. In terms of the reflex for in-group, out-group thinking, of which nationalism will be one example, we are the nation and there's the outside enemy. That coalitional psychology is an indelible part of the architecture of the human mind, right? Seeing the world as blue team and red team is a fundamental feature of our psychology. And as a matter of fact, there are so many studies that demonstrate that very, very early we start attributing people as being as part of our in-group or out-group. So there is an evolutionary argument to be made for why we have that reflex to create a delineation between us and them. Regarding your question of why I would, jump into a river to save my co-religionist or friend, so that here there are two different mechanisms. So in my earlier books, my evolutionary psychology books, I argue that there are four fundamental Darwinian modules that drive much of our purpose of behavior. There is stuff related to survival. So, for example, we've evolved gustatory preferences to prefer fatty foods because that was an adaptation to caloric scarcity and caloric uncertainty. So that's survival. Second one is related to reproduction. Remember earlier I said life is a two-step game. Survive and then reproduce. So in all cultures, men are outlandishly more likely to be Ferrari owners, even though there are many billionaire women who could afford Ferraris, because the Ferrari becomes a modern instantiation of peacocking, of sexual signaling that is desired by women. That's why men buy that, because they know that they are responding to a preference that women have. So number one, survival. Number two, reproduction. The next two are going to answer your question. Kin selection is the mechanism that explains why I would jump into a river to save 3 of my children. Darwin had argued that selection operates at the level of the organism. But if that were true, then there would never be the evolutionary pressures for me to sacrifice my life to save 3 of my children. But if I recognize that I simply am a vehicle of my genes, then from an evolutionary calculus of the gene, then that makes perfect evolutionary sense, because each of my children on average share 50% of their genes with me. Therefore, even if I were to cease to exist, if I save the packet, which would amount to more 3 children, then there would be evolutionary pressures for kin altruism to arise. So that's another explanation. But then that doesn't explain why I would jump into the river to save Gadi. Gadi is not my child. Gadi is not, my father. So there is no kin relationship between Gadi and me. I mean, unless we said the Jewish people, right? But I mean, literally in a strict genetic relatedness context. Well, the reason why I do that is because of the 4th module, which is reciprocal altruism or reciprocity. So in a social species, you have to evolve the mechanisms of tit for tat. Right? Now, some have argued that originated as a solution to caloric uncertainty, right? We're all going around in the African savannah. We all are likely to die of starvation. Why don't we strike a deal so that when we bring down the 3,000-pound game, I will share it with your family on the condition that when we are in lean times, you will reciprocate and share it with me, even though we're not biologically linked. That's why I argue many rituals of friendship, from a strict economic perspective, we don't have to pursue them, right? If I invite you for your birthday and pay $50, and then you reciprocate and pay me $50 when it's my birthday, why don't we, from a classical economics University of Chicago model, stop the charade and we both don't invite each other and we'll be at the same final end point? No, the reason why we do it is because that ritual oils our affiliation. It oils our bonds of reciprocity. And so that would explain why we would jump into the river to save our co-nationalists and so on.
Very interesting. Let me ask you a follow-up question on that about empathy. Empathy sure. is a strange thing, and it's not even limited to human beings. We feel empathy for a puppy in distress. And this is how I learned. I used to think that I like nature documentaries. That's because I saw National Geographic and not National Geographic Wild. Because when I saw National Geographic Wild, I remember seeing a few lions tear apart a baby elephant, and it took an awful lot of time. I kept switching to zapping to other channels till it was over. And I was wondering, why am I so distressed by, it's not even a person I don't know, it's an elephant in Africa that is being torn apart by lions. Why do I feel empathy? I feel distress, not just empathy.
I literally, earlier this morning, I was working on a section where I was working on exactly what you just asked. I mean, I could literally pull it out. And actually, I was working on a section. You're going to find this interesting. So Peter Singer, the philosopher, wrote a book in the early 80s about increasing the circle of whom you include in that circle, so that you feel affiliation for them and so on. His point being, as an animal activist, we should incorporate, to your question, animals within that circle, right?
Does he mention the Scottish Enlightenment?
I'm not sure if he does. You mean in that particular book?
Yeah, I'll put an asterisk and add after, but please go on.
Yeah. So, by the way, many years ago, he came on my show and we had a really interesting conversation about all sorts of things related to philosophy, but specifically, I set myself up. I asked him, given the fact that I am an incredible animal lover, am I hypocritical that I eat meat? Now, I actually don't think it's hypocritical, but I wanted to ask him, and he sort of paused, and if I remember correctly, his answer was yes. That's it. But anyways, the reason why I'm telling you that I was writing about it today is that as I was thinking about exactly the types of scenarios of, why can't I also not see the zebra being eaten alive and so on? I had this hypothesis. I said, you know what? I bet you that my empathy changes as a function of how far removed an animal is from me in the evolutionary tree of life, meaning that I will feel more empathy towards an ape than I will towards a turtle, because the turtle, the common ancestor with the turtle, diverged from us way earlier in the tree of life. And so I thought, you know what, I should probably conduct a study to test this. So then I go on to check, and just like 2 years ago, the exact same study published in a Nature journal, which of course, on the one hand, you get pissed, but that's how science works. People come up earlier than you with the great idea that you thought you had. But it still felt good that, independently
because
I had
you
come
feel
up
vindicated. Because
you feel vindicated
yeah.
that brilliant insight that you had. But by the way, I also had that insight, not insight, but that realization when I was working on my latest book, the previous book on happiness. And I would, of course, you can't not talk about the ancient Greeks when you're talking about, how to live the good life and so on. And so I would get some brilliant insight, and I would be sort of looking at myself in the mirror. My goodness, are you a brilliant guy? And then I go to check and I go, God damn it, Epictetus already said this 2,000 years ago. I'm an idiot.
Just slightly late.
Slightly. So, academia has a nice way to keep you grounded in that. Yes, of course, you come up at times with your own insights, but there's a lot of very bright people that have traversed the intellectual landscape before you. So you really have to be careful before you think that you came up with an original thought. But to answer your question of why we feel that, there are several arguments for that. It could just be, let me answer it in a couple of ways. There is a distinction in evolutionary theory between something called an adaptation. An adaptation is something that confers survival or mating advantage to you. An exaptation is a byproduct of an evolutionary process, meaning our skeletal system is the color that it is, not because it is advantageous for it to be that color, but it was just a path-dependent engineering reality. Because of other things that happen, that's the color that so it's a byproduct. It piggybacked, right? Mm-hmm. So one argument would be that you're directing the empathy toward the hapless baby elephant is just the byproduct of the empathy system that evolved for
society together.
Right. Yeah. So we are a social species, and one of the ways that we evolve emotions that keep us well regulated within human sociality is to have empathy and theory of mind. So that's why empathy evolves. That's the adaptive argument. But then it is exapted to the baby elephant in the way that you felt it.
So I'll just add one more bit of doubt to the theory that both you and someone in the science journal developed about animals having more empathy to animals the more similar there are to us, because abused children, I would argue, based on it interested me very much for a long time because it changed psychoanalytic theory, the study of children who've had horrible childhoods. And many of them love animals because they are not like human beings, because they are distant from them. So they can find empathy and a sense of a communality with something outside the species because they were traumatized within the species. So
very interesting.
So and some of what we now know, I wish I knew more medicine, or more of the science of medicine, because now we know that the restructuring of the brain, abused children have the part of the brain where empathy resides is smaller and less developed. And so, well, we should have another conversation, Gad, one day, because the meeting of the study of ideas and evolutionary theory, basically your career, is, I think, one of the most fruitful and most hopeful developments in science, because I think that I don't academia is I'm not sure it could be reformed anymore. So because of the tenure track system and all the rest of it, and because it produces also, speaking of evolution, bad character. Because what happens in academia is that the reward for conformism is just so huge that when an Einstein comes along, he has to do it outside the university. And when a Freud comes along, he has to do it outside the university, or he will be crushed. And then Freud became a dictator in his own little cult, which you just flattened, by the way, with the egotistic gene, right? Because Freud's whole psychology says that we are pleasure seeking, and we are not. If you seek survival, then pleasure is. I mean, this is what makes me more hopeful. Egotism is just a false description of human motivation. What's your view on that? Are we altruistic, or are we egotistic, or is it just the genes and not us?
Yeah, very amazing question. First, if I can give you a hint of optimism, because you said, I think that academia is dead. I think that there are institutions, many of which are contacting me, that are trying to solve that problem. So I wouldn't, to use the old term, I wouldn't throw out the baby with the bathwater. I think that there are problems in academia, but there is now a growing movement. It's still small, but there's a growing movement of either existing institutions that are trying to autocorrect or new institutions. And believe me, I'm at the forefront of that because, they're all reaching out to me for obvious reasons. So please don't give up hope on academia. We still need you. Regarding the issue of, are we inherently egotistic or altruistic? So here, I'm speaking to a fellow Jew and an Israeli. You'll be happy to hear me quote Maimonides. So in my first book, and this is almost 20 years ago now, in The Evolutionary Basis of Consumption, I talk about, altruism, philanthropy, right? Really grand, pious generosity. And I talk about Maimonides discussing the 8 levels of tzedakah, right? And now Maimonides did not call himself an evolutionary psychologist, but he was an evolutionary psychologist because he was never mind just because he was a physician, but because he is a product of evolution. He's a Darwinian being. So he has access to those evolutionary insights. And so what he basically said, you'll see in a second how I'm going to link it back to your question. What he basically said is that one of the highest levels of tzedakah, of piety and so on, is when the recipient of the altruistic act and the altruists don't know of each other's identity. And that is very pure, because then, he didn't use these words, but I'm using it in my language, because then you can't get the social signaling rewards associated, right? Even when you say at Hebrew University, you don't write it's the anonymous cancer center, right? It's the Rubenstein Cancer Center. It's the Gadi Cancer Center, right? So even though you are a philanthropist, boy, are you still getting a lot of social rewards for that, pure philanthropy. So, it's a philosophical discussion whether there is absolute pure altruism that is fully detached from any ulterior motives. My feeling would be, along with Maimonides, that level of piety is very rare. Even when I am jumping into the river to save my children, ultimately I'm doing it for very clear evolutionary reasons.
So now, in closing, let me take the ultimate risk with you, Gad.
Please.
And ask about evolution. I've always had doubts about the mathematical validity in terms of chance and combinations. I know the term in Hebrew, combinatorica, the science of
combinatorics.
Combinatorics.
Yeah.
if the short time that human beings have evolved in was enough to account for all the coincidences of gene mutations, filtered through all the changes in environment to produce this unbelievably sophisticated structure. And I kept these doubts to myself because, in civilized circles, you don't say these things. But then something came to my aid when apparently it's been discovered. I know too little about it. Two things, basically. One is that the brain is a self-structuring organism. So the way that we are made is also, there is intention, not necessarily ours. We may not have access to this intention in structuring our own neural structure. And then that trauma gets written into the genes somehow. I don't know enough about that. You probably know more than me, and maybe what I said is complete rubbish. If so, please correct me.
Yeah. So let me first mention the trauma part. So that comes. So before Darwin, the standing accepted evolutionary theory was called Lamarckism. And so after Lamarck, which was called the theory of acquired traits, meaning that the reason why giraffes have long necks is because they have to, reach further and further up so that within...
So they stretch.
Right, so that they stretch. And then, of course, the very easy, pithy argument against that is if it is the case that within the lifespan of the organism, changes in its life are passed down, then Jewish children should be born already circumcised, right? So meaning that that's not how genetic transfer happens. But recently, there is some revival of Lamarckian theory, to your point about trauma. This is called the Dutch famine studies, the most famous one, where you have children in World War II, grandparents who had gone through severe famine in World War II. Somehow the trauma that they experienced, not psychological trauma, I mean literal famine, physiological trauma, has been passed down epigenetically to their ancestors. So that's called epigenetic transfer. So there is some new hints that it's not only through direct genetic transference that some of these mechanisms happen. So that's just answering that. To your earlier question about mathematically it is impossible, we could get into all the technical details. The answer is absolutely, that's not a very compelling argument, with all due respect, because the time scale that it takes for these things to happen, it fully can capture that. Now, any alternative that people present, usually when from this side of the mouth they say combinatorially it is impossible, then from this side of the mouth, the next one, and I'm not saying that's what you're saying, is that's why therefore it must be an intelligent designer who is somewhere in the sky. Oh, I see him. He's right there by the cloud. So it is very, very difficult to take seriously the argument that a theory that has now been validated across 30 trillion ways since Darwin. I mean, literally, there is less evidence for gravity than there is evidence for the theory of evolution. That theory is on shaky grounds, but there is a guy that looks like Moses that is an exquisite designer of the 300,000 species of beetles. That's a more compelling argument. I'm going to have to respectfully disagree with it.
But doubts about one argument does not mean that you adopt another one. I personally am not religious, but there is the strand of evolution that is completely materialistic, Steven Pinker style. I think is seriously missing something. I had this argument with my dentist, who said that we have these tubes in our teeth And when they're hot or cold, we experience that as pain. And I said, what do you mean? It is pain. He said, no, you just experience it as pain. And then I asked, well, who is experiencing it? And you know where that one goes. All the way back to the
you have a much more interesting dentist than I do. I need to go to your dentist.
My dentist has retired because he's so smart that he invented something in dentistry which enabled him to stop working and just receiving passive income from here to eternity.
Wow.
You should meet him if you're interested in dentistry. Mostly. And so to conclude, let me, for the enjoyment of our listeners, because you mentioned Lamarian evolution. I don't teach biology, but I do teach in history of ideas Spencerian evolution, which unlike Darwin is teleological, because it leads to more and more sophisticated beings. And William James, you probably know this, used to mock Herbert Spencer to his students, and he described Herbert Spencer's whole theory in one sentence, and I'll read it now. Evolution is a change from a know-howish, untalkaboutable all-alikeness to a somehowish and in general talkaboutable not all-alikeness by continuous stick-togetherations and something elsifications. And once you study that description, it's actually true, because the whole view of Spencer, right, is things become more specific and need to cooperate. So from one amoeba to the whole of the economy, there's only one principle. And it was once compelling, and it's striking in my profession that no one now remembers Herbert Spencer except antiquarians. God, this conversation was everything I expected it to be and more. As you now know, I've been speaking to you for a while. You just didn't hear it. And so it's a pleasure to have a more reciprocal dialogue with you than I'm generally used to. So in conclusion, this is God's new book in Hebrew. This is an important cultural war, and it's very good for your genetic survival. So let your egotistic genes get a copy of this book in Hebrew. Thanks very much. It was a pleasure.
Thank you, Gadi. Cheers.